Well, let me begin by saying how pleased I am to be here and to thank David for all his labors. Having sweated blood on many conferences over many decades, I can appreciate how much work and how much skill went into this. Well, I want to make my response to the other speakers, which is rather daunting since there are so many of them and so interesting and varied. But I want to make my response in the form of two stories. This is especially daunting because I'm following the two greatest storytellers in contemporary American philosophy, John McDermott and Cornel West. But I'm going to make my feeble attempt to tell two stories that will be my response. And I should also say that, as I've said to McDermott, lately he's been encouraging my storytelling. But you can't blame him for my failures. I want to say first that in connection with the first story, that I was fascinated by James Kloppenberg's account of the influences of James on American social thought. And I wanted to add something to that, not so much social thought directly, and of course he had explained he wasn't going to discuss the arts. But I think that William James seeps into American culture in all sorts of mysterious ways. Not only God works in mysterious ways, but William James works in mysterious ways. So I just, in the mode of Cornel West and McDermott, I will try to explain an example of this autobiographically. I want to make the point that popular culture, at least in certain of its forms, is enormously important, philosophically important. Not, of course, only certain forms of it, but certain forms, I think, are now enormously significant. And I want to take a particular example that I was involved in, namely the work of David Milch. I don't know if you know David Milch. He is perhaps one of the premier creators of television dramas. Hill Street Blues, NYPD Blue, Big Apple, Deadwood, and most recently a television drama called John from Cincinnati, which will open on June 10th. And Milch, I would suggest to Cornel West, but is a current Chekhov. If you know much about Milch, I think you'll see something of what I mean, but I'll give you a little idea. Milch was a highly well-educated fellow. He was a Buffalo boy, I should mention, but he went to Yale just about 10 years after I did, had many of the same teachers I had, and then taught briefly at Yale, and then went on to other things and eventually into television writing. But Milch wrestled with his demons, and he wrestles with his demons to this day. He often talks publicly about being a recovering alcoholic and having been a cocaine addict and so on. So no one could be more understand the evil that so many people have talked about. And yet he is involved in creating these television dramas that, to use the phrase that Cornel West used, are in many respects tragicomic. So I want to ask West whether he would count as a contemporary Chekhov. But there are other examples. I won't. The Sopranos, David Chase's Sopranos, seems to me is another example, and I've written on the subject of the problem of evil in Sopranos. So I think, again, David Chase is another tragicomic figure who has enormous importance and is very philosophically sophisticated. But the autobiographical aspect of this is that I got an email, a frantic email, from this Canadian journalist who was just at this big conference, the press conference that David Milch had held in California to announce his new television series, John from Cincinnati. And during this television conference, he couldn't stop. Some member of the press asked him who was his inspiration for this new series. And he said, William James. So they thought, these press, what the hell are we going to make of this? You see. So then he couldn't stop talking about William James. And the journalists thought, Jesus, what we're going to... And then it got worse. Then he started talking about string theory. And, they said, what are we going to... So this poor Canadian journalist sent me this email asking desperately for help and said, look, I've got to produce this copy, within a few hours. And first of all, I want you to... He had a recording of what Milch had said, but he didn't know what the hell it was all about. He said, first I want you to know, it said Milch was reciting from memory passages from James. Just reciting from memory. So he said, now, Hare, I want to know from you whether the quotation is accurate. You see, the reason he called me is everybody looks for the web nowadays. So he looked at the web and found I was president of the James Society. Well, Hare must know. So... And then he also gave me what Milch had said about James's philosophy as a whole and said, well, is that accurate? So I frantically got out my James and so on. Milch hadn't said where this quote came from. So within about, I guess maybe half an hour or so, I wrote back and said, well, that's a quote from one of the essays in Talks of Teachers, Is Life Worth Living? Which was a natural piece for Milch to know well, because Milch, as some of you may know, has spent a lot of time in AA. And James was as I think Richardson has pointed out, James was one of the significant figures in the development of AA. So at any rate, he gave me this quotation. And it was, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. If this be not a real fight, then it's merely a private theatrical and so on. It goes on for some time. I won't try to give you the whole thing. But so I found the quotation, and I then rapidly sent an email back, and I said, well, he got it almost exactly right, but not quite right. And I very carefully gave him the exact quotation, explaining exactly what the mistake was. So he thanked me very much for this. And then, I think maybe half a day later, I got from him the text that had been printed in the Canadian newspaper. And he said, well, unfortunately, his editor himself checked to see whether Hare was right about this, and said that Hare was wrong, that I hadn't got it right, and so on. And so his editor insisted that he put down what the editor said was what James's quote was. And this, I must say, infuriated me. I didn't like to be second-guessed by this damn editor at the Canadian paper. And I wrote back and I said, I have in front of me, Ignis will appreciate this, I have in front of me the text of the critical edition. I give you exactly what it says, and I am correct. And I don't know what your editor was looking at, but it was a corrupt text. So beware the corrupt text. But anyway, my point is that someone like Milch, I think, can have enormous impact. His new series called John from Cincinnati, which he thinks is inspired by William James, but there are other philosophical things. For instance, the chief character is called John Monad, M-O-N-A-D. So you can imagine. It's not very subtle, you see. So I want to ask people like Cornel West and McDermotts and all the rest of you whether you would agree that at least some of the important drama series really are important in terms of philosophical impact and so on. But there are many other examples that could be given. I just happened to give that one because I was autobiographically involved and, as I say, infuriated by being second-guessed by some damn Canadian editor. I want to say that this also is relevant to what Cornel West was saying. I would maintain that series like The Sopranos and Milch's stuff is, when it's produced by people like Chase and Milch, is concerned with Bildung. Really, it's serious Bildung business that they're doing. That's what they understand they're doing. Of course, it's enormously commercial, and they have staggering sums. But it's very much concerned with Bildung, and it's very much concerned with evil. I mean, no one could claim there isn't plenty of evil in Sopranos. And so now, my second story concerns, well, let me again do things autobiographically. McDermott had said that his first encounter with James, if I remember correctly, was getting a copy of the brief edition of Perry's Thought and Character. I don't know, he may have said exactly what year that was, but there's strange parallel things here. In 1956, my first encounter with James, when I was an undergraduate at Yale, and I know it was 1956 because I wrote it in the book and so on, was I bought a secondhand copy of the 2-volume edition of Ralph Barton Perry. And it's significant in that same year, I bought Smith's, so I was a student of Smith's as well. I bought Smith's Royce's Social Infinite. And I also, I might say, read with great fascination Hawking's The Meaning of God in Religious Experience. And the first course I took at philosophy at Yale, one of the main texts was Dewey's Human Nature and Conduct. So I think there's a certain, I should also mention that this is again not entirely a coincidence. At the same time, of course, both Dick Rorty and Dick Bernstein were at Yale, had many of the same teachers I had. They were graduate students when I was undergraduate, but it was very much the same. So the roots, in terms of institutional roots, and of course there are deep Harvard institutional roots, but there are also deep Yale institutional roots and lots of others, including Fordham and so on. But it was my first encounter with it. But one of the things that struck me, I should also say at the same time, I bought a copy, which I still have, of Justice Butler's collection of Peirce's writings. So very early on, I had this impression of the, incredible rich variety of American philosophy. And I should also say at the same time, I was heavily involved in literature. I was on the board of the Yale Literary Magazine and heavily involved in evaluating poetry and so on. But I want to stay away from that for the moment. But one of the things that struck me, and I wrote my undergraduate thesis on, was the way in which, in American thought, theism has been modified in so many different ways. So I wrote my undergraduate thesis on the debate as it stood in 1956 between Hartshorne and Whitehead. And that's how I first became acquainted with all the different ways that people could modify theism for various purposes. And then I may say I also argued with, as many people did, with Hartshorne over many, many years in print, in correspondence, in bars, everywhere. He used to come to Buffalo because his daughter married somebody in our university. So I had this very strong impression of what I called back in the 1960s quasi-theism. And I wrote considerable about this in the 60s and 70s. But I soon abandoned the term quasi-theism because people like Lewis Ford got terribly upset about the whole thing. They thought this was a derogatory term. I've never yet been able to find a satisfactory, for various reasons, satisfactory substitute for it. But the best I could do was process theism. But the reasons I could explain, and perhaps we'll get to, that I don't think is satisfactory. But I think that when I've given talks, as I used to very frequently in the 60s and 70s, not only in this country but in other parts of the world, people just didn't have an understanding of what I would call this very rich tradition in American philosophical theology. Of course, they've read books about the history of religion in America. They have some general idea. But when it comes to the philosophical theology of Josiah Royce, for instance, that Frank Oppenheimer so beautifully discussed, they're only a very superficial thing. And I remember I gave a talk once at Claremont School of Theology, the heartland of the Whiteheadians, And they're terribly sweet there. I mean, John Cobb was a dear, David Griffin. And I, in my talk, of course I was critical of them, very critical of them, but I said, look, something like this has been done by a whole lot of people in American thought. There's a rich tradition of this sort. But they were very sweet about it, but the Whiteheadians just wanted to discuss the Whiteheadians and the Hartsonians. They really didn't want to get into, how this connected with Royce and how this connected with all the other things. And I found the same thing true. I mean, if you get my experience is when you talk about this kind of thing with the Roycians, I think they tend to, there are exceptions, of course, they tend to think, well, I don't really need to discuss the Whiteheadians. But I would maintain, and this is a very long story, I would maintain that there's as I've briefly described this to David, there's a very long tradition beginning at least as far back as Jonathan Edwards, but it becomes enormously important when you get to Emerson, of what I'm calling these all sorts of modifications of theism. And this also is a very important tradition, I think, because it deals very centrally with the problem of evil. And, of course, that's what I was mainly discussing back in the 60s and 70s. I was discussing with the process people whether they could solve the problem of evil. And, of course, I maintained none of their theodicies worked. I also maintained that Royce's didn't work either. But at that point, I didn't try to cope with Peirce. But this is relevant. Practically every speaker has said something about evil. So I really think that one of the enormous motivating factors in this very sophisticated philosophical theology that's been going on for hundreds of years is the problem of evil. But they have very, very different ways of doing it. So I really think that now that I think something may have happened to turn the tide on that. I mean, I noticed that there are two new books that have come out on Peirce and theology. Now, I mean, there were some work on that, but I think it's now getting to the point where some people really are giving sophisticated treatments of Peirce's philosophical theology. It's very difficult. In fact, I would maintain that in many respects it's the most difficult philosophical theology ever written, because in order to make sense of it, you've got to know a lot of philosophy of mathematics, you see. And how many people who are in theology know a whole lot of philosophy of mathematics? They don't know anything. They don't care. So, but I think you can only understand Peirce's efforts if you see that this is part of a very rich tradition. But I want to stress that I'm not saying that there haven't been lots of histories of religion in America, but they haven't focused on this really very sophisticated, very subtle, and in some cases, as in Royce and Peirce, enormously complicated stuff. And so it surprises me, and you've got a group of terribly distinguished people like this, I mean, no question of recognizing the importance of the pragmatist tradition, and I certainly have devoted my life to that. But I really think that throughout the world there should be a recognition that there is this allied tradition in philosophical theology, which is also a very important original American contribution. Let me say a little bit more why I think it's important, and I'm hoping that people like Frank Oppenheimer will comment on this. In my talks about this abroad, I've often said that, well, what you have to understand is that in this discussion of the concept of God, the redesigning of God, as it were, builds into the very concept of God values which are very much associated with America. Built into the very concept of God, a form of theism, is pluralism, is a kind of democracy. I mean, as the Whiteheadians, of course, always stress, God, in the Whiteheadian view, doesn't coerce, he only persuades. And as Frank Oppenheim has so much stressed, the spirit interpreter interprets, he doesn't command. You see. So my suggestion is that this not only is a very sophisticated philosophical theology, but it's in many respects very characteristically American, because this whole notion, not just the practice of religion, but built into the very notion of God, are these things that people associate with America. So I think that this kind of tradition, there should be a story of this. I'm urging David or somebody, have somebody write this story. This philosophical theology, starting at least with Edwards, really needs a Louis Menand. Or we thought Luke Menand might be here. I guess he hasn't come here. But anyway, it really needs somebody who tell the story of this to get people interested. And so there wouldn't just be the Whiteheadians who discuss this, but there would be an overall, and just the Royceans, but there would be an overall understanding of this. And it could then be known as a very rich and long tradition, which is prospering, as I'm sure Professor Willis will say. There are now many Protestant thinkers who, I know some of them, and they don't always mention these people. But a lot of this is simply taken for granted. They simply talk in that language. They can't help themselves. And I don't think they think of this as being particularly this tradition, but I think it is. It's something that is now built into a lot of the... I expect if I listen to lots of lectures at Harvard and Yale Divinity School, I'd say, well, it sounds like absolutely part of this tradition. So I'm very much hoping that this sort of story will be told, and I'm hoping that people like Frank Oppenheim can, in our later discussion, comment on how those connections might be illuminated and what kind of story might be told. Well, that ends my two stories. Thank you very much.